You felt it your whole life. That quiet dissonance, that invisible gap between who you are and the people you were born into. You watched them like a stranger might observe a foreign ritual. The way they spoke, the things they valued, the rules they followed without question, and deep inside a whisper. This isn't me. Not out of rebellion, not out of arrogance, but out of an unshakable inner knowing, as if you were dropped into a family whose language your soul had never spoken. And for years, maybe decades, you wondered if something was wrong with you, why you didn't belong, why you didn't fit, why you were always watching life from the outside. Carl Jung had a word for this feeling: individuation. Not just finding yourself, but realizing that you are not a copy of your family, that the very structure you were born into was not a sanctuary, but a crucible. It wasn't designed to reflect you. It was designed to awaken you. Because sometimes the soul chooses difficult soil, so it has no choice but to grow deep roots. Jung believed that the family was the first mirror, the place where the psyche first encounters its shape, its limitations, its expectations. But for some, that mirror is warped. You look into it, and you don't see yourself. You see a version crafted by fear, by generational trauma, by silence passed down like an heirloom. Maybe your parents projected their unlived lives onto you. Maybe they punished the parts of you they were forced to repress in themselves. Maybe love always came with conditions. Whatever the shape, your childhood was not a home, but a test. And here's the haunting part. You tried to pass it. You bent. You shrank. You silenced your questions, your anger, your uniqueness, all for the illusion of belonging. But that sense of dissonance never left, because your soul was never meant to stay there. It was meant to outgrow there. Jung once said, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents." And perhaps you were born to carry that burden, not to continue it, but to break it, to be the one who says, "This ends with me." That is not a small task. It is, in fact, a sacred one. But sacred work rarely feels noble when it begins. It feels like loneliness, like being the only one in the room who sees the wound no one else wants to name. It feels like grief, grieving the love you needed but never received, grieving the safety you never had, grieving the fantasy that one day they'd change. They'd apologize. They'd finally understand. You are not alone in this grief. There are thousands, millions, who were born into families that couldn't hold their light, families that called their authenticity disrespect, their sensitivity weakness, their boundaries betrayal. And yet, Jung believed this rupture was not random, that the psyche, your psyche, has a teleological pull, a direction, a destiny, a soul compass pointing you through the pain, not around it. And that's the radical idea, that you were born into the wrong family, because that wrongness would become your fuel. Your parents may have tried to teach you conformity, but they accidentally taught you truth. By betraying your essence, they forced you to protect it. By neglecting your emotional needs, they made you acutely attuned to the inner world. By rejecting your voice, they awakened your need to listen inward. You became what they were too afraid to become. And in that, the cycle began to break, but not without cost. Because being the cycle breaker, the black sheep, the outsider, is not a badge you wear. It's a wound you carry. It bleeds in silence. It aches in therapy rooms. It screams in the privacy of your journal. And still you go on, because something inside you refuses to be shaped by dysfunction. Something deep and ancient is pulling you forward, into selfhood, into integrity, into purpose. That something is the self. In Jungian terms, the archetype of wholeness, the blueprint of who you were before the world told you who to be. And that self will not rest until you reclaim everything you had to disown to survive. Not just your joy and confidence, but your rage, your grief, your intuitive knowing that things were not okay. You are remembering now. You are waking up to the fact that you weren't too much or too emotional or too intense. You were accurate. You were reading the emotional landscape correctly, and they didn't want to be seen. So they told you that you were the problem. They made you the scapegoat, the black sheep, the dreamer, the difficult one. But here's the truth Jung invites you to consider. What if you were born into that family, not because you belonged to them, but because you were meant to transcend them? What if your very presence was the first crack in an ancient system of silence? What if your soul chose this exact pain, so that one day you could transform it into wisdom? This is not spiritual bypassing. This is not about excusing abuse or romanticizing trauma. This is about meaning, about refusing to let your suffering be in vain, about becoming the alchemist of your own life. And like all alchemy, it begins in the dark, in the confusion, in the ache, in the question that won't go away. Why was I born into this? And now, finally, you begin to see. You weren't crazy. You weren't defective. You weren't cursed. You were chosen, not by your family, but by your fate. And that fate doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for acceptance. It asks only one thing, that you become who you truly are. Even if that means losing the love you once begged for. Even if that means walking alone, at first. Even if that means rebuilding from scratch. Because what you're building now isn't just a life that looks good from the outside. You're building a soul that can hold itself. On the inside, there's a secret few ever dare to name, that what we carry in this lifetime often began long before we were born. Your anxiety, your self-doubt, your compulsions, they may wear your face, but they echo with the voices of generations past. Carl Jung called this the collective unconscious, a psychic inheritance, patterns, fears, wounds, passed down not through DNA, but through the soul. And within that inheritance lives something even more intimate, the family unconscious, the hidden agreements, unspoken rules, and suppressed emotions that run silently beneath your family's surface, shaping everything. You were born into a field, not just a household, but an energetic ecosystem, charged with the unresolved pain of those who came before, addictions that skip a generation, shame that's never named but always felt, dreams that go unlived and turn to bitterness. You didn't just inherit your grandmother's eyes, or your father's last name. You inherited their unfinished stories, their silences, their compromises, their ghosts. And that inheritance isn't always obvious. It lives in the way your mother flinched when you cried too loudly, in the way your father shut down whenever emotions entered the room, in the way love always came with a price. Jung believed these unconscious transmissions create what he called complexes, emotionally charged knots in the psyche, built around unresolved experiences. You may not know why certain things trigger you. You just know they do. The chaos of others makes you freeze. Praise makes you anxious. Success feels dangerous. These aren't random. They're signals. Psychic fingerprints left behind by emotional patterns that go back decades, sometimes centuries. And here's the wild part. These patterns repeat until someone sees them, until someone feels them, until someone says, it stops here. That someone, more often than not, is the one who feels like they were born into the wrong family. Because they are wrong for it, wrong in all the right ways. Too awake, too sensitive, too attuned to the unsaid. They see the elephant in the room and wonder why no one else will name it. They feel the tension in family dinners and think it's their fault for noticing. But it's not a flaw. It's a function. The soul picks them, you, because you can feel what others numb, because you won't play along with the silence, because you're willing to lose belonging in order to gain truth. That's why the system rejects you, because systems, especially toxic ones, will always expel what threatens their balance, even if that balance is built on denial, even if that balance means everyone stays asleep. You, the one who doesn't conform, you become the scapegoat, the black sheep, the crazy one, because your awareness is dangerous. It threatens to unravel the entire psychic arrangement. And maybe you've tried to dim it, to play along, to be what they wanted, but your nervous system always knew. This isn't safe. This isn't truth. This isn't you. That's not delusion. That's intuition. And intuition is the compass that guides you out of inherited trauma, into individuation, Jung's word for the journey of becoming whole. Individuation isn't about becoming different for the sake of it. It's about becoming yourself, even if no one in your family recognizes that self. Even if it means standing alone. Even if it means grieving the family you wished you had. That grief is part of the initiation. Because here's the twist most people miss. Healing doesn't mean fixing your family. It means freeing yourself from the obligation to carry what isn't yours. To stop holding the guilt, shame, or roles you were never meant to carry. You were not born to be their therapist. You were not born to absorb their pain. You were not born to fulfill their dreams at the cost of your own. You were born to break the chain. And breaking it looks like letting yourself be angry, letting yourself be different, letting yourself stop explaining. You don't need to justify your boundaries. You don't need to prove your healing. You just need to walk your path, the one your ancestors couldn't walk. Because when one person steps out of the pattern, they shift the entire lineage. The shadow they carried becomes your light. Their silence becomes your voice. Their fear becomes your clarity. This is soul work, ancestral work, sacred work. And it's not easy. You will be misunderstood. You will be judged. You may even be cut off. But remember, rejection from a system built on dysfunction is not a loss. It's a release. And the space it creates becomes the place where your real self can finally emerge. A self not shaped by trauma, but by truth. A self not defined by survival, but by sovereignty. This is how the cycle ends. Not with vengeance, but with vision. Not by fixing them, but by facing yourself. Not by staying in the old story, but by writing a new one. Your story. There's a silence that follows the truth. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of separation. Of stepping back from the family you once prayed would see you. Of walking away from the roles you once wore like armor. Of choosing yourself, fully, unapologetically. And when that moment comes, it does not feel like triumph. It feels like death, because something does die. The illusion that you could ever belong in a place that never made room for your soul. Carl Jung understood this rupture. He saw that individuation, the path of becoming whole, often comes with isolation. Because when you stop betraying yourself, you start betraying everything else that demanded your silence. The system, the tradition, the bloodline. You start to feel like an exile. In your own life, the birthday invitations stop. The phone grows quiet. Family gatherings feel like foreign lands. And beneath the courage of your choice comes a deep ache. An ache for the family you wished existed. An ache for the love you almost had. An ache for the innocence you lost the moment you saw the truth. This is the grief no one warns you about. The grief of healing. Because healing doesn't just mean feeling better. It means feeling everything you've kept buried for years. The sadness, the rage, the fear of being alone forever. You'll question yourself. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I should just go back. But deep down, you know the truth. You didn't walk away because you stopped loving them. You walked away because you started loving yourself. And that love demands protection. It demands space. It demands boundaries, even when they're misunderstood as betrayal. Because in a toxic family system, love is often mistaken for loyalty. Loyalty to pain. Loyalty to silence. Loyalty to dysfunction. And when you choose authenticity over allegiance, you become the threat. You become the mirror they've spent their whole lives avoiding. You become the evidence that the story they told themselves wasn't true. And for some, that's unbearable. So they project. They turn your growth into selfishness, your boundaries into punishment, your truth into drama. But don't let their story become your shame, because the very thing they reject in you is the thing they buried in themselves. Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." And so they exile you, not because you're wrong, but because you're real, because you feel, because you question, because you remember what they tried to forget. And still, the ache remains, even when you know it was necessary, even when you know it was the only path forward. You grieve, not just for the family you lost, but for the self you had to hide to survive. You grieve for the child who sat at dinner tables full of tension, pretending everything was fine. You grieve for the teenager who played the role, just to keep the peace. You grieve for the adult who finally said, "No more." This grief is sacred. It is not weakness. It is evidence that you are no longer numb, that you've stopped shrinking yourself to be digestible, that you've stopped betraying your instincts to earn love, that you've stopped performing a version of you that was never real. And slowly, something begins to shift. In the quiet after the storm, clarity, you realize that the family you were born into was the beginning of your story, but it doesn't have to be the end. That biology is not destiny. That blood is not the only bond. That your true family may be found, not inherited. People who see you, not just tolerate you. People who value truth over tradition. People who honor your path, even if it looks nothing like theirs. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to parent yourself. You become the nurturer you never had, the protector, the witness, the guide. You sit with your own pain, not to fix it, but to feel it. You speak to the child within you with the words. No one ever said, "I see you. I believe you." You were never wrong to feel. You never had to earn love. And in that reparenting, you start to rebuild a sense of safety. Not in them, but in you. This is how the exile becomes the elder. Not through age, but through initiation, through descent into darkness, and the decision to bring back light. You may have lost a family, but you've gained something far more powerful. A self that refuses to abandon you, a voice that cannot be silenced, a heart that beats in alignment with your truth. There comes a time when the pain no longer defines you, when the wound no longer bleeds. It still exists, it still whispers, but now it no longer speaks for you, because something deeper has taken root. Integration. Carl Jung believed the self was not some perfect, angelic version of you. It was the totality, the whole, the conscious and unconscious, the light and the dark, the healed and the still healing. You were never meant to get rid of your past. You were meant to reclaim it, not by glorifying the suffering, but by honoring the strength it gave birth to. The moment you stopped chasing approval from those who could never love you fully, you created space for real belonging. The moment you stopped performing and started listening inward, you made contact with the self. This is the alchemy Jung spoke of, the turning of lead into gold. And the lead, it's the parts of you they said were too much, too sensitive, too intense, too different. These were never defects. They were the clues, the very ingredients your soul needs to fulfill its purpose in this life. You see, the chosen ones aren't chosen because they're superior. They're chosen because they remember. Remember what? That we come here not just to survive our families, but to transform their legacy. Not just to break cycles, but to birth new ones. You weren't born into the wrong family to suffer. You were born into it to see, to witness what others denied, to feel what others numbed, to choose what others feared. And that clarity, that sight, it's your medicine. Because the moment you begin to live aligned with your soul, with your intuition, your creativity, your fire, you become what Jung called a wounded healer. The one who has walked through fire and returned with something to offer. Not advice, not dogma, not superiority, but presence. You stop trying to convince. You stop needing to explain. You simply embody. And that embodiment, that integrated beingness, becomes a lighthouse to others still lost in the fog. It's not about being perfect. It's about being real, showing your scars without shame, holding space for pain without panic, living truthfully, especially when it's inconvenient. That is how the world begins to change. Not through force, but through frequency, through your vibration, through your choices, through the silent revolution of becoming whole in a world that profits off your fragmentation. You may never get the apology. You may never be invited back to the table. You may never feel at home in the places that raised you. But you'll realize you were never supposed to. Because home isn't where you were made. It's where you are met. And you will find it in the ones who speak your soul's language, in the silence that finally feels safe, in the purpose that keeps finding you, even when you try to look away. You were born into the wrong family, so you could become the right ancestor, the one who stops the transmission of pain, the one who ends the war within, the one who returns to the line not with blame, but with light. You become a living prayer, for every ancestor who couldn't heal, and for every descendant who won't have to carry what you did. This is the hidden meaning. Behind the wrong family, the wrong story, the wrong beginning, it was never a punishment. It was a passage, a rite of becoming. So if you felt out of place, take heart. If you've been cast out, take space. And if you've been walking alone, know this: you're not lost. You're becoming. And what you become will echo across timelines you'll never see. It's not just your life that heals. It's the lineage. It's the soul of humanity, one awakened heart at a time. And all of it began the moment you said, "This ends with me." Subscribe to the Awakened Compass and join our membership to unlock the full journey within.